3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
Coming up is a podcast brought to you by the dedicated and diverse volunteers at 3CR. Just a quick message before you get there. For the month of June, we're asking listeners to donate to the station to help us keep going. We rely on the generous donations of community to survive. Go to 3cr.org.au/donate and show your support for community-owned and community-run media. Thanks for your support and happy listening.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. It's broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Satellite. The program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is heard across Australia, as I said before, by the Community Radio Network. It is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name's Joseph Toscano, hosting today's program. Those of you who were listening to this before we went national today, I'd just like to remind you of John Burns' funeral. Activist, atheist, unionist, father, grandfather, well known in Melbourne activist circles, and there's a celebration of his life to which his daughters have invited all the people he's been involved with over the years to come and join them on Monday at 10 a.m. on the 27th of May at the Rose Brighton Chapel at 139 Marriage Road. Chapel. There was a notice in yesterday's Melbourne Age regarding the funeral, and if you want further information you can also ring me leave a message on 0439 395 489. I also like to mention the death of Jane Brown Rigg, an important member of the 3CR community in Melbourne, a volunteer and presenter of Music Matters. Jane died after a long battle with leukemia last week, and we extend our condolences to all her family and friends. Now, if you wonder what anarchy is all about, an anarchist society is a voluntary, non-hierarchical society which is based on the creation of political and social structures which are based on equal decision-making power, which are based on holding wealth in common and using it for the common good. Very conservative ideas, obviously. To get from here to there, it's a radical path, but the actual essence of anarchism, to break down hierarchy, is difficult but possible. And human beings for thousands of years have been trying to create institutions and structures and systems which incorporate every member of that society. And what we've seen over the past, thousands of years is other sections of society trying to dominate society by their exclusive ability to exercise power and their ability through that exercise power to concentrate wealth in their own hands at the expense of the majority of people. Sometimes you've got to wonder. The mineral industries in Australia is under pressure. They're under pressure to cough up. So what do you do when you're under pressure? You put out a beautiful little ad on social media and the legacy media about what a good corporate citizen the Australian minerals industry is. And they boast, that's right, boast in this feel-good advertisement that they pay $63 billion in taxes and royalty every year. That was last year. And I'm thinking, what do they think we are? Total morons? Do they think we've only got one non-synaptic neuron functioning in our brain? I mean, the taxation revenue in this country is almost $1 trillion. That's right, $1 trillion, 1,000 billion. And they're saying they pay $63 billion in taxes and royalties? What's that? It's not 10%, is it? It's about 6%. Could you imagine if the profits that are made from this country's extensive mineral resources, coal, oil, no, not so much oil, gas, uranium, gold, bauxite, nickel, copper, cobalt, and silver. I could go on and on. Iron ore, if I got the big one. And that went into the consolidated revenue. Do you think most of the problems we have here, I talk about every day or every week, would be occurring? Of course they wouldn't be occurring. So no wonder they're feeling under pressure, because people are saying, you bastards aren't pulling your weight. You're the leaners in society. Because of government-friendly legislation, which has basically given away this country's natural resources to a handful of corporations, the rest of us have to suffer. We have to have 1 million children living in poverty. We have to have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. We have 32,000 registered charities, many of them looking after basic needs of people in a society that's rich. And they're harping about the fact that they paid $63 billion in taxes and royalties last year. What a total con. So let's increase the pressure. Increase the pressure. The country's resources belong to this country's people, First Nations and the rest of us. That's who should be profiting from the exploitation of these resources. Not these corporations whose major responsibility is to create ever-increasing profits for their major investors. And if they think a pretty advertisement is going to sway Australians about what good corporate citizens they are and the fact that they are pulling their weight in the society, they've got something coming. All they've highlighted is that they're under increasing pressure for taxation revenue to be markedly increased. And hopefully in the future that all these companies will be nationalised without compensation. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. All right, it gets worse. The housing crisis. I'm sure you're sick about hearing about the housing crisis, especially if you're in insecure housing, or you're renting, or you're paying off a mortgage. Because remember, in this country, about 25% of people own their homes outright after a lifetime of drudgery, wage slavery. About between 35 and 38% now are renting, and almost everybody else is paying off a mortgage. So we've got a housing crisis. Everybody's blamed. Immigrants are blamed. Overseas students are blamed. You name it, we blame them for the housing crisis. Lack of labour, having a lack of labour is blamed. And the solution to the housing crisis is staring you and me in the face. An increase in public housing stock, as occurs in many social democracies across Europe. Increase public housing stock. And I'll go through this again. It is so simple, but nobody in authority seems to be interested. And at the same time, while it's obvious that an increase in public housing stock increases security for the individual and families, the fact is that governments at the state level in almost every state of this country are falling over themselves to privatise what's left of the public housing stock under the title of community social affordable housing, which is just another name for privately owned housing, which is just as insecure as private rental, because basically there's no security of tenure, and usually rents in these institutions are 5% greater than rents in public housing. And obviously if anybody opens their mouth to complain, it doesn't take long for them to find themselves on the street. So we've got this housing crisis. So it's all about giving money to community social affordable housing sector, giving money and taxation breaks to the private sector. That's right. That's what corporate welfare is about. Giving money and taxation breaks to the private sector to please build a bit more housing. What a total disaster. Now I'll go through this simply, and it's about capitalist economics. It's got nothing to do with anarchism. It's very simple. You need competition in a capitalist society. The real estate market is totally dominated by the private sector. To have real competition in a capitalist society, it's not about different corporations, taking off 1% here and 1% there. It's about having an exceptionally strong public sector, which is the only sector which can actually compete against corporate capitalism, as well as the creation of a cooperative sector, which nobody seems to be interested in this country. So, how do you solve the public housing crisis? Instead of giving money to the community social affordable housing sector, instead of giving money to private investors, instead of allowing private investors to claim a tax deduction for owning more than one home, why don't we use that money to create public housing? And if there isn't enough labour to create more public housing, the states could spot purchase houses and units across their areas to provide much needed public housing. So what happens as the number of people in public housing increases? Well, it's simple. As the number of people in public housing increases, the number of people who need to rent privately decreases. As the number of people who rent privately decrease, rents fall. Very simple. Simple capitalist economics. As rents fall, investors in the housing market will sell, and they'll sell at a lower price. And that means people who haven't been able to enter the housing markets as purchasers will be able to once again purchase properties at a reasonable price. So what are the social values of having a strong public housing sector? Not just a public housing sector which is set aside for people in dire emergencies or of, major social issues. What happens is you have security of tenure, which means children can go to the same schools, go to the same sporting clubs, have the same friends. Over the period, they attend school and are educated, which means there's less crime, less social dislocation, less anxiety, less psychological and psychiatric issues in the community. increasing the public housing sector is a win-win situation. And it shows you how far governments in this country have moved from their responsibility to look after the interests of the people who elect them, the citizens. For far too long, especially over the past 50 years, it's been the interests of those who own the most, which are almost at the forefront of governments' minds when they introduce legislation to tackle crises like the housing crisis. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. If you are interested in this, and you may not be, but if you are, I suggest you join public interest before corporate interests. That's right. Because what we need is a strong social movement, political movement, cultural movement that puts the interests of the many, that's the public, before the interests of the few, that's the corporate sector. And for far too long, people have equated public with second rate. And obviously you equate public with second rate when you have public services which are starved of funds and staff. Public does not need to be second rate if the necessary staff and finance is directed in its direction. I mean, look at the education sector. Look at the billions of dollars which are given to private schools. I mean, if you want to send your little kiddie to a private school, fine, but you cough up the cash. It's the same with the private health sector. $8 billion to the private health insurance. That's corporate welfare. All right. Moral equivalence. You like that? Moral equivalence. Now, I noticed that Mr. Dutton is getting these little fear-mongering campaign for the next election. It seems to be gaining a little bit of momentum. Old Dutton boy, you can see him jump up and down when it comes to, refugees, asylum seekers, Israel. I mean, what a loser. What a total loser. Not him personally, but his party. And I heard people in the last 24 hours talk about moral equivalence. Moral equivalence between Hamas and the State of Israel. They claim that the International Criminal Court advice, the prosecutor's office wanting prosecutions for the Prime Minister of Israel, the Foreign Minister and a number of Hamas leaders, is somehow equating their struggle on the same footing. There's a moral equivalent. And people like Dutton and Biden jump up and down and say, how can you compare Hamas's strategies to Israel's strategies? The problem with the successive Israeli government, the way they have treated the Palestinian people, is there has been systemic impunity. Total systemic impunity. Total support from Western governments. Total impunity. Now, the International Criminal Court judgment on the fact that Netanyahu and his foreign minister and senior leadership in Hamas, are war criminals or potential war criminals, was based on the fact. One, it was based on the fact of what happened on, was it October the 7th? But it also, as far as the Israeli state is concerned, it was based on the fact that the Israeli state is now using starvation and collective punishment of civilians as its major strategy in dealing with Hamas in Gaza. That's what the indictment is about. It's not about the bombing campaign. It's not about the slaughter and carnage that has occurred. It's not about the information regarding the way Palestinian prisoners are tortured by the Israeli state. But it's about collective punishment and starvation being used as a weapon to win that particular dispute. There is no moral equivalent. There really is no moral equivalent when you have a state supported by some of the most powerful states on the planet being armed to the teeth to deal with a population which is basically located in the world's biggest prison in Gaza. There's no moral equivalent. But the thing is, we need to understand the Liberal National Party in this country is, would love to win the next election. And I've noticed that the Murdoch-based media and other sections of the media and social media are all jumping on the fear campaign. Just extraordinary, as nobody seems to have learnt anything. That if you want to solve the Palestinian violence, the Palestinian issue, you need to come to some type of political solution which is acceptable to both sides. The body count, 35,000, that's just the Palestinian body count. We don't know what the Israeli military body count is because they don't put out figures. We do know that the Israeli body count was about 1,200 on the 7th of October. So the body count will increase because what's happening in Gaza is the classical situation that occurs in guerrilla war. Once the Israeli state occupies Gaza, if it wants to continue a military operation, it will continue to lose soldiers on a day-to-day basis because obviously the Hamas forces are not going to come out in this situation and confront the military head-on. But what we are seeing is the beginning and continuation of a guerrilla campaign, irrespective of whether there is an Israeli government military victory or not. And to see people like Dutton jump up on that bandwagon is just unbelievable. Well, it's not unbelievable. When you've got no policies to offer people apart from nuclear power stations, harsher sentences, you need to be able to generate fear in the community. Fear which isn't based on reality. And when you have sections of the legacy media and social media jumping on this wagon, it creates the political momentum for change. And change, political change, that is based on strengthening the power of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And that's what the Liberal National Party policies are all about. So look at, see what's happening. That's the beauty. Look at what's happening. See how the fear is being created. Look at the momentum. And at the same time, it's your job. That's right. Your job, not just mine. Your job to talk to the people around you and explain what this is all about. When we're told that people can't go to Melbourne University or Sydney University by the leading lights of the Liberal Party because of a little encampment on campus and everybody feels under threatened, and you need to, the Commonwealth needs to put the federal police into campuses to break up these minuscule protests, and that's no reflection on the protests themselves. You begin to understand how fear which is generated out of situations which are non-violent, non-fearful, can change, create that momentum that things are falling apart. All right, let's move on. Now, the housing crisis again. Let's get back to that because I'm interested in the housing crisis because if you look at figures, and I like to look at figures, especially economic figures, I like to look at them. Yeah, maybe I'm a bit mad. But I should change that, a lot mad. See, what the housing crisis has, it has done something exceptionally important to the capitalist economy. You see, every individual, apart from the 1%, has a fixed income. You know? Now, that income, in the majority of people's cases, over 70%, is used to look after their day-to-day needs. It's only a small proportion of the population, I think it's about 8 to 10%, that has enough disposable income to get involved in the investment merry-go-round, whether it's stocks, shares, housing. So when you've got a limited amount of income and your costs go up, and the costs which have escalated have been costs in mortgages because of increased interest rates, 14 interest rate hikes, I think over 15 months, an increase in rents which have almost doubled over the last 3 years, and you've got a fixed income, you've got to make some decisions. Do you want to maintain a roof over your head for you and the kiddies, or do you want to splurge? And what happens is people don't splurge, which means they stick to buying the essentials. That 16-foot, television you're going to buy, well, we'll put it on the back burner. Those restaurants you're going to go to, we'll put it on the back burner. Those gigs you're going to go to, we'll put it on the back burner. All those plastic and metal shit you can buy, which you don't really need, we'll put it on the back burner. So what the housing crisis is doing, and the housing crisis is basically increased rents, increased mortgage repayments, it's sucking the life out of the Australian economy. Now, next time I hear a business person or a business owner complain about government regulation and government charges, how about complaining about the fact that the housing crisis is sucking the life out of the economy, which means their businesses have the potential to go bankrupt? Think about it. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. This program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. The program is heard across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. The program is also streaming live on 3cr.org.au. Just like to remind people that next week is National Reconciliation Week. Since the defeat of the Voice referendum, questions about reconciliation, treaty, whatever, have all disappeared because no government looking at the result is going to move forward regarding reconciliation, knowing full well there isn't community support for it. There are no votes in it, boys and girls. So that's why it's important people like us who believe that change is about momentum, and the defeat of the Voice referendum was defeat of the momentum towards treaty, need to celebrate National Reconciliation Week. So National Reconciliation Week is booked in by two important dates. The 27th of May, which is Sorry Day, National Sorry Day, and the 3rd of June, which is Mabo Day. Both important days in this country's history. Both important days. And so I encourage you to see what's been organised in your part of the world and to attend some of these reconciliation events, because this is one way we can actually restart that momentum towards not just reconciliation but compensation and treaty. So we'll be doing a few things here in Melbourne. I mean, the Anarchist World this week is involved in. On the 3rd of June, Mabo Day, we usually hold a small ceremony at Federation Square in Melbourne at midday. This is a Monday this year, so it goes for about an hour maximum, to recognise that on the 3rd of June 1992, the High Court of Australia found, surprise, surprise, that this was not terra nullius, that there were people here before European colonisation, and they had rights to land in law because of their prior occupation of this land. So we'll celebrate Mabo Day, and obviously many of you will be commemorating Sorry Day. So there are events. Look them up. Get involved. We will be. We encourage you to. All right. Noumea Kanaky, Kanaky. Australia has a black history. New Zealand has a Maori history. And New Caledonia has a Kanak history. Now, it ceases to amaze. I never get ceased to be amazed by the ignorance in society regarding our near neighbours. Now, I've noticed that over the last 48 hours, the media, the legacy media and the social media, is giving us, little sob stories about people who've been trapped in New Caledonia, and I understand that. But the trouble is, nobody's talking about why, the background. So I'd just like to make a few comments, just like to bring people up to date with what's happening in the world. Because, New Caledonia, or Kanaky, is only 2.5 hours flight, from Sydney. I think 3 hours from Melbourne. Now, New Caledonia has been a French colony since the mid-1850s. And after Devil's Island, it was one of the most extreme, brutal penal colonies the French state had. And waves of political prisoners, including the communards from the Paris Commune in 1871, and as well as Algerian freedom fighters, the Arab Berber freedom fighters, over 2,000 and over 5,000 communards, as well as so-called ordinary criminals, were sent to Noumea. But unfortunately for the French colonisers, there was a population, an indigenous population, which had been there for thousands of years with their own languages, their own culture, their own structures, their own society, the Kanaks. And over the last century, or even longer, over the last 140 years, we've seen the Kanaks rise over and over again, trying to achieve independence. But unfortunately for the people of New Caledonia, the Kanak population, New Caledonia has one of the richest nickel mines in the world. And the French government has been very loath, as it normally is, to give its colony its independence. And the previous outburst of violence was in 1988, when an agreement was made with the Kanak population. Now, I'll just give you a few figures just to give you an idea. Now, New Caledonia isn't this huge piece of land in the Pacific. There are only about 300,000 people in New Caledonia. That's right. The New Caledonia is it's part of France, in inverted commas, and it's divided into 3 provinces. There's the Loyalty Islands, which are the islands around New Caledonia, which are part of it, and they're inhabited, about 95% of the inhabitants are Kanaks, original people. There's North Province, and about 70% to 75% of the North Province consists of Kanaks. And there's the South Province, where most of the violence has occurred, where only less than 30% of the population are Kanaks. About over 40% of the population are Kanaks, about 25% of European descent, and 11% are described as mixed race, and then obviously there's other groups of people that have come to the area. So after 1988, there was an agreement to hold a number of referendums regarding independence. And there's been 3 referendums held. The first one was defeated, 53.4%. I think the next one was about 52.3%. And the third one, the Kanak population boycotted it because it was during COVID-19 and they didn't believe they were able to campaign effectively. So, the French government, understanding that the number of people in New Caledonia or Kanaki who want independence will increase over time and the colony will become an independent nation state, have changed legislation in terms of who can and who cannot vote to dilute the pro-independence struggle. Now, the pro-independence struggle has been led for a number of decades by the Kanak Socialist National Liberation Front, the FLNKS, the Kanak Socialist, and I'll reinforce that word, Socialist National Liberation Front. Now, the riots which have occurred mainly in the southern province, when the French Parliament announced its intentions to dilute the ability of the independence voters to achieve independence, has occurred mainly in the South Province. And it's occurred mainly in the South Province because the Kanak regions of New Caledonia, the North Province and the Loyalty Islands, are relatively poor in comparison to the rest of the island. Relatively poor. And young people have been at the forefront of these riots, and have been at the forefront of these riots because they see no future for themselves in a New Caledonia, which is basically part of France, where they are treated not just as second-rate citizens, but as far as the economic opportunity is concerned, they have minimal, if no, economic opportunities. So I think if you begin to understand what's happening in the ground and what's happened over the last 150 years, you can understand why there is just such resistance to this current move to dilute the ability of pro-independence people, both European and Kanaks, in New Caledonia to achieve their goal. You know, you'd think the French Parliament, considering the history, would have understood that, because you've got to understand there are 300,000 people in New Caledonia. There's over 1,000 police there. There's over 2,000 troops stationed permanently in New Caledonia. Another 1,000 have been flown in over the last few days in order to restore order. Like Gaza and the West Bank, there is no, and West Papua, there is no military solution to these issues. The only thing that will work are political solutions which are based on trying to fulfill the aspirations of significant sections of the population which have for so long been kept subjugated, not just in terms of colonial subjugation, but in terms of their economic opportunities. Talking about economic opportunities, Telstra. Well, they're going to shed 9% of their workforce, about 2,800. Now, look, I found it fascinating that the Telstra CEO, by law, had to tell the investors before the workers that the workers are going to get the boot. And then I found it fascinating, as you know, that the Telstra workers, if they went out on a wildcat strike, would find themselves fined $10,000 a day, each individual worker, under this country's current legislation, because striking is illegal in this country. And then I found it even more fascinating when the Telstra CEO and so-called commentators were talking about the introduction of artificial intelligence, robots, in the mix. And I thought to myself, is this just a Telstra issue? Or is this an issue for society as a whole? Our society, Australian society. Because, see, the time where there is most social dislocation and violence in any society is the time when the way people earn a living is upturned. We saw this at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We are now going to see this at the beginning of the artificial intelligence revolution. Because human beings have now reached a stage, as far as technological development is concerned, that we don't need everybody to work. That's right. And the way our society is structured, it's structured on a wage system. Unless you're an investor, which is only a small part of the population, you need a wage. And if there is no work, there is no wage, apart from a social security benefit, which means you basically find yourself leading a hand-to-mouth existence, an insecure hand-to-mouth existence. Now, you may find this strange, but the Roman Empire had the same problem. They didn't have machines, but they had slaves. What happened is as the Roman Empire expanded, they were able to acquire more and more slaves, the patricians, the ruling classes in the Roman Empire. The plebeians were no longer needed because the patricians could actually use slaves, which they didn't have to pay, to run their estates. But unfortunately for the patricians, the Roman plebs, the plebeians, had political powers. And they had to do something in order to stop them from constantly rioting and ruining their little partnership. So what they did is they introduced a universal basic income. Bread and circuses. Heard the term bread and circuses? Subsidised food, subsidised housing, 240 public holidays, entertainments in the Colosseum, and the list went on and on. So I'm not suggesting we reintroduce the Colosseum and put our corporate and political leaders in the Colosseum. That's in the Colosseum while we watch from the seats around them. But the time for a serious discussion about a universal basic income has come. Sorry for tautology. It's here. Because we're not going to need everybody to be in paid employment in order for society to prosper. But we're going to need to do something in order to keep people entertained, off the streets, stop them rioting, burning things down. And how do you get a universal basic income in a society like Australia? You nationalise the mineral industries. There's enough resources there, not just a piddling $63 billion, hundreds of billions of dollars. There's enough resources there to pay for a universal basic income for the next century. Think about it. The time when the way people earn a living is threatened and there are major social change is the time that rebellion, revolts, riots occur. And those of you who think that revolution is impossible, that nothing will ever change in the society, look at the examples of history. Look at the social dislocation during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Look at how that was handled. And look at the situation we find ourselves now at the beginning of the artificial intelligence revolution. Very similar situation. And those of you who are interested in following this particular line of thought, I encourage you to come along to the presentation I'll be doing at the Footscray Hotel if you're in Melbourne on the third Wednesday of June, where I'll be looking at the Tolpuddle martyrs and the impact they had on the empire, the British Empire, not just Australia. So we do live in interesting times, but interesting times create difficult situations. And I was thinking to myself, yes, I do think occasionally, what a rogues gallery of world leaders we have today. Putin, International Criminal Court subpoena. Netanyahu, International Criminal Court, possible subpoena in the next few days. Who have we got? Our beautiful Chinese leader, North Korean leader. I've never seen so many dictators around the place. And we've seen the rise of authoritarian figures, in Europe, who most likely will gain political power in their sovereign nation states over the next few years, running on a fear campaign, fear that we're all going to be swamped, not by the climate emergency, but by migrants. Think about it. What a rogues gallery. The president of Argentina. And then these are people, in many cases, we elect. Look at the rogues gallery in Iran, the rogues gallery in Israel, the rogues gallery in the United States of America, the potential rogues gallery here in Australia, the rogues gallery in so many places in the world. And you think to yourself, is that the best we can do as human beings? Is that the very best we are capable of? Is that what we need to elect? Look at the little tussle that's going to occur between Trump and Biden in November. What an extraordinary lack of imagination. But the dilemma is, as we say, as anarchists, the dilemma is, with the centralisation of power comes extraordinary consequences. We see this. We saw this in Europe during World War II. We see it today in many parts of the world, where power has been concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and wealth has been accumulated by fewer and fewer people. So what we've seen during this period is the concentration of power in elected and non-elected rulers, and the concentration of wealth as a result of the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution, which has been part and parcel of the neoliberal agenda. We see this, and we are now reaping the benefits of that issue. What a rogues gallery, put up the pictures, have a look at them and think, my God, not that I believe in God, but my gods, how could we as a human, how has the human race found itself in this situation in 2024, in a period of universal education, universal communications, as if we've all lost the ability to think rationally. Yep, let's move on. Now, obviously, you and I don't live in a vacuum. We may want to live in a vacuum, but we don't live in a vacuum. There are extraordinary pressures which have been exerted on people, whether they're social pressures, cultural pressures, religious pressures, and economic pressures. And they have an impact. because we're social animals. They have an impact on the way we live, the way we react. And I noticed that the Queensland Chief Health Officer has declared an adolescent mental health crisis. And he said this adolescent mental health crisis is caused by social media. And I'm thinking to myself, is social media the cause, or is it a symptom or a sign? And the fact is, it's very easy, and I'd be the first, it's very easy to say everything that's happening is a consequence of the influence of social media. And social media is nothing more than a few, corporate-owned platforms which will do anything to get your eyeballs on it so they can sell you advertising, about your own so-called needs. Because, you see, it's not just an adolescent mental health crisis, although it's more pronounced in adolescence. It's also a community-wide mental health crisis. I've been a doctor 49 years. I only work part-time now. I've never seen so much anxiety in the community. Anxiety which may be fanned by social media and the corporate-owned legacy media and political figures who want to generate fear as a campaigning tool. But it's more than that. I mean, what we are seeing is the logical end game of a society which has totally allowed either the state, as we see in China, or the corporate sector to dominate every aspect of their existence. And when adolescents look at the road ahead of them, whether they look at it, clearly or not, they begin. You get a creation of a climate of what I describe as a no future climate, a generation which believes it has no future. So no wonder we're seeing anxiety, and there is a mental health crisis in this country. You ask people how many of them are on antidepressants, and you'd be amazed. You would be amazed how many people are entering counselling. Because you see, it's not because of our individual failings. It is because of our collective failings, because we have allowed this society, which is based on a private investment for private profit mentality, to erode every aspect of our living. Decentralised energy sources. I've been talking about them for years, and it was nice to hear a few commentators say in the last 24 hours, maybe we should be looking at decentralised energy sources. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. If you're into YouTube, have I got YouTube channels for you? Public interest before corporate interests. 271 presentations by yours truly on every subject under the sun. Then, if you're interested in historical precedents and the impacts they have on society today, well, I encourage you to go to my other YouTube channel, josephtoscano.com, where you'll see the presentations I've been doing at the Footscray Hotel regarding important pivotal moments in Australia, in world history. Yes, you can join the other 3 people watching the video. Also, you can go to. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. And don't forget those friends and colleagues and fellow activists of John Byrne. There'll be a celebration of his life at the Rose Brighton Chapel at 139 Marriage Road, Brighton, on Monday the 27th of May at 10 a.m. See you there. And don't forget, You can always listen to the Anarchist World This Week on your podcast when it suits you. But the important thing to remember is it doesn't matter what I say, it's what you do that matters. Change comes, as we saw in New Caledonia, when enough of us are willing to make it a central part of our life to be involved in that struggle to change society by devolving power and holding wealth in common.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
Did you enjoy listening to that podcast? 3CR is a community radio station, and you, the listener, are a part of that community. Right now, it's our radiothon. We need you to pitch in with a few dollars to keep the station going. We can't do it without you. It's easy. Head to 3cr.org.au/donate. Your donations really matter.